Step into a world of heartfelt dialogues, where vulnerability is embraced, and meaningful connections are nurtured. "Max, are you still here?" Mrs. Miller inquired, her eyes filled with genuine concern. "Don't you have some responsibilities or duties to attend to?" Max replied, his tone underscored by a slight plea, "Actually, not right now, Mrs. Miller. You see, they haven't admitted any serious cases today, so I've completed all my assigned tasks. If you don't mind, may I stay a little longer? I hope you don't feel the need to send me away. Remember, I'm using this time to prepare for my upcoming educational journey." Mrs. Miller, an experienced nurse, sighed cautiously. "Interesting. I didn't get the impression that you were particularly invested in such pursuits," she countered. "At first glance, it seems like you're just idling away your time here, doing nothing productive. Wouldn't you be better off immersing yourself in your textbooks?" "Mrs. Miller, my time here isn't wasted," Max replied seriously. "I may not be actively working, but I'm gaining invaluable practical experience." Mrs. Miller understood the subtext of Max's statement about gaining experience and responded with a disheartened shake of her head. However, what Mrs. Miller didn't know was that Max's frequent and prolonged visits to this particular department were driven by a romantic interest in Leah. Her undeniable beauty and allure had captivated him. Yet, she also exuded an air of arrogance that was hard to ignore, resembling that of a snake, slick and potentially treacherous. There stood Max, a grown man, infatuated with the enchanting but aloof Leah. Some might argue that his infatuation was a private matter, in which others had no right to interfere. Still, Mrs. Miller couldn't help but feel a twinge of sympathy for him. He was a kind and compassionate young man, always eager to offer a helping hand. However, Mrs. Miller had a strong conviction, born from years of observing human behavior, that Leah would never reciprocate Max's affectionate feelings. The thought of the likely heartbreak awaiting him was a bitter pill to swallow. Max, a former soldier, had chosen to pursue a career in the medical field after his military service. The desire to become a medical professional had been in his heart for a long time, and the timing had finally aligned for him. His motivation to enter medicine wasn't driven by the allure of a big paycheck, rather, he was genuinely intrigued by the inner workings of nursing and the direct impact it had on patients' lives. Mrs. Miller had confidence in Max's potential as a medical professional. He possessed not only an impressive intellect but also a deep interest in understanding patients' experiences and a heartfelt desire to help them. Max's palpable enthusiasm for becoming a doctor was evident, and it left a lasting impression on Mrs. Miller. She believed that his dreams could indeed become a reality, as long as Leah's actions didn't crush his spirit. Fortunately, Leah was not on duty that day. Instead, it was Eleanor's shift, which was scheduled to start later in the evening. Eleanor came from a charming and unassuming background, hailing from a rural farming community. Her family's hardworking and generous nature had influenced her deeply, instilling in her a willingness to lend a helping hand to those in need. While Leah dutifully performed her job responsibilities, such as administering injections and taking patients' blood pressure, Eleanor consistently went above and beyond. She was known for her willingness to lend a helping hand to the janitorial staff, assisting them in moving equipment around the hallways or changing soiled linens in the wards whenever she had a spare moment. Eleanor's actions showcased her innate kindness and unwavering commitment to the well-being of the hospital community. As her evening shift began, the department phone rang, and Eleanor picked it up attentively. After a brief conversation, she turned to Max and requested his assistance. "They've brought in an elderly woman. They need some help. Could you go down?" she asked. Max nodded quickly and hurried down to the reception desk. There, he found the elderly woman lying unconscious on a stretcher, her frail form evoking deep sadness in his eyes. Concerned, Max inquired about the circumstances from the paramedic. The paramedic shook his head and replied, "No, it wasn't a car accident. She was found in her home, but the details are still unclear." her neighbors discovered her on the stairs. Max's gaze returned to the elderly woman, his heart filled with empathy. "She's in pretty bad shape," he observed quietly. "Considering her age, it's uncertain if she'll pull through." The medical team swiftly transported the woman to the intensive care unit, where Max remained by her side, offering any assistance he could. Eventually, the attending physician, Dr. Austin, began reviewing her scans and called Max over. "Hey, intern," he said, "take a look at these. You might learn something." Max carefully studied the scans for an extended period, but nothing appeared amiss to his untrained eye. He handed them back, admitting, "I'm not sure if I should be looking for anything specific, but I don't see anything unusual." Dr. Austin reassured him, "That's okay. It's common when you're just starting out. There's nothing wrong with these scans. However, your body does show signs of extensive bruising." Max was taken aback, curious about the implications of such findings. "What does that mean?" he asked, seeking further clarification. Dr. Austin suggested, "Why don't you think about it during your shift? We'll discuss our respective findings in the morning." Max nodded in understanding, knowing that Dr. Austin often presented them with challenges to solve, a task he usually handled well. This puzzle was no exception, and he mulled over every word as they walked together. Dr. Austin emphasized the importance of identifying the cause of a disease to effectively treat it. Though Max didn't entirely subscribe to this idea, he acknowledged a kernel of truth in it. Turning to the CODA, continuous documentation assistant, Dr. Austin instructed, "Make sure you monitor her blood pressure hourly and administer pain medication as needed." "That's our plan for now." "Understand, Dr. Austin." Eleanor, the CODA, inquired about the situation, and Dr. Austin deferred, "We'll hear Max's side of it in the morning." Eleanor playfully teased Max, giving him some training, huh? Dr. Austin joined in the playful banter, grinning at Max, "Indeed, unless he's not interested in becoming a real doctor." Max dedicated the entire night to scouring the internet for insights that might shed light on the medical puzzle. Periodically, he returned to the old woman's bedside to closely observe her condition. During one of these visits, he noticed tiny crimson-blue marks scattered across her body, unmistakably bruises. Dr. Austin's earlier observation was spot on. The patterns of bruising were not consistent with a simple fall. To have such marks, the woman would have had to experience multiple falls down the stairs in various ways. Lost in a sea of hypotheses, Max struggled to find a plausible explanation. Yet, as often happens with elusive answers, the solution came to him while he was deep in slumber. As morning approached, a tired Max had fallen asleep on the couch. In his dreams, he revisited a haunting memory from his childhood. He saw himself as a young boy, merely 6 or 7 years old, sitting on the living room sofa. His mother was occupied in the kitchen while his father was away at work. Max eagerly awaited his father's return, anticipating an evening of learning the enchanting game of chess. At that time, Max's family lived in a small, tight-knit town where everyone knew each other, and even the dogs of the neighbors were recognizable at a glance. The sense of community was strong, and the low crime rate made it uncommon for people to lock their doors. As the front door slammed shut, Max's mother looked up with a smile and announced, "Here comes Daddy." But as she turned to greet her husband, her smile turned into a look of sheer disbelief. Natalie's voice trembled as she stammered, "What are you doing here?" A stranger stood in the doorway, his face twisted into a malicious grin. Young Max instinctively recoiled, feeling an ominous aura emanating from the man. The stranger sneered, "Can't even muster a polite good evening, can you? You weren't expecting me, were you, wife?" "I'm not your wife. I haven't been for 5 years. Why are you here?" Natalie replied, her voice trembling but defiant. "Calm down, wife. Stop calling me that. Stop calling me that. I'm not your wife. That was your decision, wasn't it? Did you ever stop to think if I had a say in it? Probably not, the man, Leo, retorted, holding her gaze, filling the room with tense silence. No one bothered to ask me. No one cared about my feelings. Do you want my opinion? Leo's voice rose, seething with resentment. I disagree with your decision. I don't think it's fair that a man has to clean filthy prison floors while his wife is off enjoying life with another man. His mischievous grin quickly turned into a scowl. Leo, you have to leave, Natalie pleaded, concern etched into her features. You're scaring Max. That's my son. Leo countered, his tone chillingly nonchalant. He needs to get used to my rules. Natalie grew impatient, sensing the escalating tension. Her voice rose as she retorted, he's not going to get used to anything. He already has a father, and I have a husband. She took a deep breath and tilted her head slightly, her eyes filled with despair. Please, Leo, she begged softly, please go. Leo remained silent, seemingly considering her plea. He raised his eyebrows in silent response, as if to say, well, looks like you chose the hard way. He placed his hand on the wall and stepped further into the room, exploring his surroundings, glancing over the photographs lining the walls. He casually picked up various items and put them back down as he meandered. Natalie watched him warily out of the corners of her eyes, her breathing heavy and quick, fear evident in each exhale. Get out, she spat through clenched teeth. The words had barely left her mouth when a hard slap struck her cheek. The next thing she knew, Leo's fists were raining down on her. As she crumpled to the ground, he continued his assault, now using his feet as weapons of choice. Max, witnessing his mother's suffering, sprang into action and rushed to her defense. With a shrill scream, he lunged at Leo, sinking his teeth into the man's hand with all the force his small frame could muster. Caught off guard, Leo yanked his hand away with such force that Max was flung across the room. The impact with the wall knocked him unconscious. The events that followed would only come to Max later. Suddenly, a man named Cole, whom Max knew as his father, burst into the room from outside. Cole grabbed the baseball bat that was propped against the wall by the entrance and lunged at Leo. The brutal beating ended as quickly as it had begun. The sight of his wife in distress and his unconscious son in the corner fueled Cole's rage. In a blind fit of emotion, he did what anyone might have done in such a frenzied state. The court sentenced Cole to prison for manslaughter. The first year in prison took a heavy toll on his mental health. He contracted pneumonia, from which he would never recover, despite the best efforts of doctors. Natalie spent a long time in the hospital, her injuries eerily similar to those of the elderly woman now under Max's care in the intensive care unit. Max awoke from his sleep drenched in sweat. This recurring dream always culminated in the same traumatic scene, him hitting the wall and slipping into unconsciousness. As Max grew older and understood the implications, Natalie recounted the disturbing events of that fateful day. Before their marriage, Leo had seemed perfect in every way. During their courtship, Leo had been charming and generous, leading Natalie to believe they could build a beautiful life together. However, after marriage, their seemingly idyllic family life turned into a living nightmare. Leo's behavior changed drastically, becoming carelessly extravagant, squandering money despite having no steady job. Yet, he always seemed to have what he wanted. After Max's birth, Natalie began to suspect that Leo was involved in illegal activities, possibly connected to the local gang. She repeatedly urged him to give up his shady dealings and live a law-abiding life, especially for the sake of their son. But her pleas fell on deaf ears, and when she begged him to reconsider, his smirking reply was etched in her memory, "Are you suggesting that I become a factory worker like you and your pathetic father? Why not? At least then Max wouldn't have to be ashamed of his father in the future." That day marked the first time Natalie was physically abused, prompting her to leave Leo immediately. The following day, he was arrested for robbery and sent to jail. Max had no memories of his biological father, and Natalie filed for divorce soon after. A year later, she remarried Cole, a kind-hearted man who truly cared for her and her son. In Max's mind, Cole became his real father. In the present day, Natalie continued to work at the notorious factory, known for its harmful emissions. Max, lost in thought, pondered the elderly woman's situation in the intensive care unit. At over 70 years old, who could be so heartless as to harm such a frail person? Despite his best efforts, Max struggled to connect the dots, unable to reach a definitive conclusion. He began questioning the validity of his hypothesis. As the time for Dr. Austin's arrival approached, Max finished his duties for the shift. Spotting Dr. Austin in his usual spot, Max realized that the doctor had already visited the elderly patient. "Eleanor, could you get the test results, please? If everything checks out, we'll move her to a regular ward," Dr. Austin instructed. "Right away, Dr. Austin," Eleanor replied. As Dr. Austin turned, he saw Max approaching. Here comes our future doctor. So, what have you deduced?" Max looked at the doctor with a solemn expression. "I have a theory, but I'm not sure you'll find it very impressive." As Max began to lay out his findings, Leah arrived to change shifts with Eleanor. Engrossed in his discussion with Dr. Austin, Max didn't notice Leah's entrance. "I'm all ears, Max. Your time to shine. Go ahead," Dr. Austin encouraged. Glancing down at his notes, Max began to explain. "Well, you see, Dr. Austin, everything indicates that she was the victim of a physical assault. What I don't understand is why the neighbors didn't report it. And I'm stuck trying to figure out who could have beaten her up like that." Dr. Austin sighed and said, "Well, I'm not surprised. Not at you, but at your conclusion. Part of our job is to help the police answer questions like that." Overhearing the conversation, Leah grinned and interjected, "Come on, you guys. You don't need to be a detective to figure out what happened. Look at her, another drunk, probably arguing with her husband over a bottle of whiskey or something." Eleanor nudged Leah lightly in the side, but it did little to soften Leah's callous words. Leah's voice grew even louder, and she continued to express her callous opinions. "Am I wrong? These people drink like fish and fight, and we end up wasting our time trying to save them. We shouldn't bother. Society would be cleaner without them." Dr. Austin turned to her with a stern look and responded firmly, "Leah, I sincerely hope you'll never get sick. But if you do, I hope you'll be fortunate enough to have people like Max around to take care of you." With that, Dr. Austin left the room, leaving Leah with a moment of reflection. She then turned her attention to Max, trying to manipulate him with her flirtatious demeanor. Her next request, however, struck a nerve with Max, as he realized the dismissive way she made it. "Max, can you get me a cup of coffee?" In that moment, Max's thoughts were elsewhere, pondering something entirely different. When he snapped back to reality, he realized the inappropriateness of Leah's request and her lack of empathy for the elderly woman's plight. It made him reevaluate his feelings for her. With newfound clarity, Max responded, "You can get your own coffee, you have 2 working legs." Leah was taken aback by his assertiveness, and Eleanor, who was filling out a report nearby, struggled to hide a grin at the unexpected turn of events. The following day, Max's first order of business was to visit the ward where Mrs. Luke had been transferred. As he entered, he asked her how she was feeling. She expressed gratitude for the pain medication, which had made her feel much better. "Thank you, Max." "I'm glad you're feeling better, ma'am," Max replied warmly. "If you need anything, please don't hesitate to let me know," Max offered before he prepared to leave the ward. However, just as he was about to go, Mrs. Luke called out to him. She took a deep breath, struggling with her decision to ask for help. "Excuse me, Max. I know this may sound strange, but I don't know where else to turn. I can't reach my house, and it's probably locked. I need some things. Could you bring them to me? I can give you some money. Sure, Mrs. Luke. What do you need? Max replied with kindness. Oh, it's not much, just a few things from the store and some fruit, Mrs. Luke said humbly. That night, Max shared the situation with his mother, Natalie. Filled with concern for the old woman, Natalie packed some items for Mrs. Luke. However, the worry took a toll on her, and her blood pressure shot up. She couldn't bear the thought of Mrs. Luke being alone and helpless. The next day, Mrs. Luke was visibly surprised when Max unpacked the items that his mother had sent. Max, you didn't take the money last night. Did you pay for these things yourself, Mrs. Luke? My mother is an elderly woman like you, and when I told her about you, she was concerned. She wanted to give you these things, Max explained. Your mother is such a kind-hearted woman. Thank you both very much, but this is too much. I don't understand why you are so kind to me. Don't worry about that. The important thing is that you eat well and stay healthy, Max reassured her. Thank you very much. Can I pay you back? Mrs. Luke asked. That's not necessary, Mrs. Luke. It's no problem at all. Now please get some rest. We're going to look for your relatives. You have relatives, right? Max inquired. Yes, I have a son, Mrs. Luke confessed, a glimmer of sadness crossing her frail features. Max couldn't help but wonder why Mrs. Luke's son hadn't come to check on his ailing mother. He must be worried about you. We'll contact him, and I'm sure he'll be here soon. For now, just focus on regaining your strength, Max reassured her before turning to leave the room. However, Mrs. Luke's weak hand gripped his arm with a sense of urgency in her eyes. Max, could you do me a favor? Could you tell my son that I won't live or that I'm already dead? I'll do anything to keep him away, she begged, her voice shaking. Shocked by her words, Max turned to face her. Was it your son? Did he hurt you? He asked, a sinking feeling in his stomach. Tears welled up in Mrs. Luke's eyes as she shook her head quickly. No, it wasn't him. It was my fault. But please tell him I'm gone. Max was shaken by her words. He couldn't wrap his head around it. Why would a son hurt his own mother like that? He thought of his own mother and felt a shiver run down his spine. The very idea seemed grotesque. Shaken, he paced the hall, trying to dispel the disturbing thoughts. Just then, Mrs. Miller, another nurse, approached him. Max, are you okay? Why are you shaking your head? The old woman also has a visitor. It seems to be her son. He doesn't seem very friendly, if you ask me, she said. Max's heart pounded at her words. He's the one who did this to her. He has to be kept away from her, he replied, determined to protect Mrs. Luke. Mrs. Miller looked at him in shock. Her son, her own flesh and blood. Max, are you absolutely sure? She asked. Yes, Mrs. Miller. Unfortunately, it's true, Max confirmed. Then where is he? I must confront him. Mrs. Miller's voice was filled with concern. Max rushed to the front desk to find the son's information and make sure Mrs. Luke would be safe from any further harm. Ignoring Mrs. Miller's warning not to make any rash decisions, Max proceeded to the reception area and spotted a scruffy man engaged in a heated argument with Eleanor. When are visiting hours? I have to see my mother now. She's got all my cards. Do you expect me to starve? The man, John, exclaimed with frustration. Eleanor looked puzzled by the situation. So your mother has all your cards? That's none of your business. You ask too many questions, John retorted defensively. Overhearing their exchange, Max hurriedly returned to Mrs. Luke's room to inform her of her son's arrival and mentioned the situation with the credit cards. John, Mrs. Luke's son, had been living with her for several years after his divorce. He had a chicken past, with a history of run-ins with the law for various offenses. Unemployed, he relied on his mother's pension for financial support. Mrs. Luke, being a retiree, took joy in tending her garden and tried to persuade John to get a job and take responsibility for his life. Her attempts at guiding him were initially gentle and patient, but John kept coming back to his mother for money. He gradually began using her credit cards and made it a regular habit. Mrs. Luke lived modestly and didn't spend much of her pension. However, John convinced her to let him handle her finances, promising wise investments in stocks. Reluctantly, Mrs. Luke agreed, on the condition that John attend rehab and give up his destructive habits. He complied, but unbeknownst to his mother, he left the rehab center after just a week. He called her a month later, claiming steady improvement and talking about investing as a hobby, leading Mrs. Luke to feel hopeful and joyous. Yet, it was all a facade to regain her trust. As soon as he had access to her cards again, he fell back into his old habits. The following months were filled with endless arguments and fights between mother and son, as John's behavior continued to spiral out of control. Now, with John back at the hospital, Max could sense the tension and frustration surrounding the situation. Mrs. Luke's request to keep her son away became more understandable, as it seemed evident that John's presence was causing harm and distress to his mother. Max knew that addressing this delicate family issue would require great sensitivity and care. The situation escalated to a breaking point the day Mrs. Luke decided to revoke John's access to her cards. Coming home drunk, John demanded the cards, and when his mother refused, he violently attacked her, pushing her down the stairs before fleeing. Despite the horrific incident, Mrs. Luke felt compelled to protect her son, unwilling to involve the police out of fear for his future. Feeling a burning rage after hearing Mrs. Luke's heartbreaking account, Max left her room and walked to the reception area where he saw John arguing with Eleanor. Acting on impulse, Max stormed in and grabbed John by the collar, overcome by anger and disbelief. "You heartless beast! How could you hurt your own mother?" he raged, lifting John off the ground. Confused and frightened, John struggled as Max pinned him against the wall. Mrs. Miller screamed in alarm, urging Max to leave him alone. Realizing that he couldn't let his anger lead to a violent confrontation, Max took a deep breath, trying to control himself and avoid legal consequences. With one last warning, he released John and led him toward the exit. "If you dare show your face around Mrs. Luke again, you'll regret it." John hastily fled the hospital, shouting back threats. "You'll pay for this. All of you, Max." Drained and shaken by the intense encounter, Max sank to the floor, his chest heaving with sobs. The emotional turmoil of the situation weighed heavily on him, but he knew that protecting Mrs. Luke was the right thing to do, even if it meant facing the consequences of his actions. The incident had stirred up painful memories from Max's own past, memories of his mother, also a victim of abuse. Witnessing violence against the weak always brought back traumatic images from his childhood. Within an hour, the police arrived at the hospital, and Mrs. Miller and Eleanor earnestly explained the events involving John and his threats. They recounted how he demanded access to restricted areas and the harsh words directed at Mrs. Miller when she refused. Dr. Austin provided a detailed report of Mrs. Luke's injuries, evidence of the physical abuse she endured at the hands of her son. With Max's encouragement, Mrs. Luke agreed to press charges against John, understanding the importance of seeking justice, regardless of their relationship. The officer reviewing the injury report expressed shock at the extent of the injuries caused by John. The police collected statements and information before leaving, promising to apprehend John and ensure a thorough investigation. If the evidence stacked up, John could face a lengthy prison sentence. 2 weeks later, it was time for Mrs. Luke to be discharged from the hospital. Max was eagerly waiting for her in the hallway. Eleanor, full of excitement, asked if he had seen her yet. Max smiled warmly, replying that she was there for him as well, wanting to visit Mrs. Luke. As Mrs. Luke was wheeled out of the ward, Max noticed a look of concern on her face, which didn't escape the attention of those present. "How are you, Mrs. Luke?" Eleanor asked, giving the older woman a warm smile. "I'm fine, thank you for asking," Mrs. Luke replied, managing a small smile of her own. Leah lingered nearby, trying to hide her inner conflict after her ill-spoken words about Mrs. Luke earlier. Mrs. Luke felt isolated and vulnerable, without immediate support. As she grappled with the harsh realities of her situation, panic slowly began to envelop her. Each breath she took was shakier than the last as she tried to maintain her composure. The hospital corridor seemed to shrink around her, and the world felt distant as her own thoughts overwhelmed her. In that moment, her eyes fell on Max, whose warm smile became a beacon of hope in her rising fear. Her heart calmed a little. Just then, an elderly woman approached with a bouquet of flowers, introducing herself as Natalie, Max's mother. Natalie mentioned her garden and asked for Mrs. Luke's advice on fertilizer while planting petunias. Mrs. Luke was taken aback but soon found herself engaged in a lively conversation with Natalie. Max joined them, explaining that Natalie hadn't had anyone to talk to for a while, which prompted a serene expression on Mrs. Luke's face. The weight of her worries momentarily lifted as she enjoyed the companionship and the warm exchange of words. The bond between the two women, ignited by their shared love of gardening, grew stronger with each passing day. Natalie's genuine interest and empathetic listening brought comfort to Mrs. Luke's heart. A spark of companionship had been lit, illuminating the path ahead. Mrs. Luke realized she wasn't as alone as she had feared. The presence of Max and Natalie reminded her that there were people who genuinely cared and were willing to offer their support. The once imminent panic began to dissipate, replaced by a newfound sense of hope and camaraderie. As the days passed, a deep friendship blossomed between Mrs. Luke and Natalie, and Max could see the positive impact it had on both of them. With Mrs. Luke's scheduled discharge approaching, Max and Natalie had a heartfelt discussion. They recognized the challenges Mrs. Luke faced and understood the importance of providing her with ongoing support. They made a compassionate decision to care for her, offering her a home in their lives. Together, they prepared a comfortable room for her, ensuring she would have a peaceful and nurturing environment. They arranged for all the necessary medical equipment and supplies, making sure her well-being was their priority. In addition to helping Mrs. Luke, Max also saw how caring for her brought healing to his mother, Natalie. Their shared understanding of abuse and the strength they found in each other's company was invaluable. The decision to welcome Mrs. Luke into their lives was a turning point for all of them. As the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, they became an inseparable trio, supporting each other through life's challenges, celebrating each other's victories, and finding solace in the warmth of their newfound family. Their shared love of gardening had indeed bridged the gap between them, cultivating not only beautiful flowers but also deep-rooted bonds of love and compassion. Their bond, built on empathy and shared experiences, blossomed with each passing day. Eleanor admired Max's thoughtful actions, and he, in turn, was captivated by the sparkle in her eyes. Eleanor offered her help with gardening, and Max warmly welcomed her, opening the door for her to be a part of their lives beyond just gardening. As they spent time together, Eleanor and Max formed a deep connection, sharing stories, debating, and finding joy in each other's company. Mrs. Miller, noticing their growing closeness, couldn't help but express her admiration for Max, seeing him as a fine young man. Mrs. Luke's hospitalization seemed to fade into the background as Eleanor's presence and their shared moments of laughter and joy became the focus. Eleanor's desire to spend time with Max's family brought him immense happiness, and he couldn't contain his excitement. Their relationship blossomed, and news of their romance spread through the hospital, bringing smiles and happiness to the staff. With time, Max and Eleanor officially became a couple, and their love story continued to flourish. Their newfound connection brought light and warmth into their lives, reminding them of the importance of empathy, kindness, and the healing power of companionship. They had found solace in each other, and their shared experiences had brought them closer than ever. Together, they navigated life's challenges, supported each other's dreams, and cherished every moment they spent together. As they stood side by side, facing the world together, their bond grew stronger with each passing day. Their love story had bloomed in the most unexpected circumstances, and they knew they were meant to be. Their journey together had just begun, and they eagerly awaited the adventures and love that lay ahead. Their weekends together became a source of joy and comfort for all. Laughter filled the air as they enjoyed each other's company at home, relishing in the shared affection and camaraderie. Eleanor's wit and humor brought a playful energy to their gatherings, endearing her not just to Max, but to his family as well. One sunny afternoon, the doorbell rang, and Eleanor, being closer to the house, went to answer it. To her surprise, Leah stood on the doorstep with a freshly baked apple pie in her hands. The enticing aroma of the pie filled the air, momentarily distracting Eleanor from her initial astonishment. Leah quickly clarified that she had no romantic feelings for Max and had come to apologize for her past harsh words. A wave of relief washed over Eleanor, and she warmly embraced Leah, accepting her apology with an open heart. With the tension of the past set aside, the group spent a peaceful afternoon together. They sat in the living room, savoring the delicious apple pie and sipping warm, aromatic tea. The atmosphere was filled with newfound understanding and friendship as they shared stories and laughter, finally able to move past the previous misunderstandings. From that day on, Eleanor and Leah developed an unexpected bond. The olive branch Leah extended had blossomed into a genuine friendship, and they found themselves enjoying each other's company. The weekends became even more vibrant as their circle of support and affection expanded. As they shared meals, stories, and heartfelt conversations, the group grew closer, and their weekends were filled with love, laughter, and the warmth of true friendship. Eleanor's presence had not only brought happiness to Max and his family but had also fostered a sense of unity among them all. Each weekend became a cherished time of togetherness, celebrating the beauty of forgiveness and the power of newfound friendships. Thank you for watching and listening to my story. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something. If you did, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more stories like this. And don't forget to share your thoughts and feedback in the comments below. See you next time.